Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much. Can everybody see the screen? I hope everyone can see that, and maybe I can hide these controls. Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to everybody who made the time to attend. This is going to be very much a sort of big picture talk. I will get into some sorts of specifics towards the end, but it's going to be very much an overview, I think, of the terrain as it seems to a philosopher. Let me see if I can hang on a moment. There we go. So I will begin I understand this is an old custom in Australia, which I understand is spreading into North America as well. But I will begin by paying respects to the custodians of the land. The University of Sydney is built on the land of the Gadigal people. I am actually not in Sydney today. I'm on Jarinja land, a couple of 100 kilometers south of Sydney. That, for people who may not know, on the bottom left is the flag of Aboriginal Australia. The one in the center is the golden wattle, which is the flag of the Eora. And on the bottom right, that is the flag of the Torres Strait Islanders, and it is in or near the Torres Strait that we begin. I'm going to move this back again now. I don't know where the best place to actually, maybe I should just minimize this. This is an informant talking to the Australian physician and anthropologist John Court. And we are in the Wellesley Islands, which, for those of you who know the map of Australia, at the top, it looks like someone's taken a huge sort of bite out of it. That's where we are in the Gulf of Carpentaria. And we're talking about Malgry. So Malgry is a condition that involves pain in the lower extremities, in the legs in particular. It involves nausea, gastric upset, headaches. So it's a somatic condition. It's caused, or at least according to the people who live in the Wellesley Islands, the cause of this condition is eating terrestrial water and then going into the terrestrial food like a land turtle, swamp turtle, and then going into the sea without washing your hands, or alternatively eating maritime food like a sea turtle rather than a swamp turtle, and then going on land without properly purifying. So it comes from eating an abominated food in the wrong place. But you can avoid this if you stick to your own particular part of the archipelago, where there is a totem animal that governs the local customs and habits. Yarragara, the sea eagle, if Yarragara knows you, then you will not Malgry. But if Yarragara doesn't know you and you go into the wrong part of the island and you eat the wrong food in the wrong way, then you'll get sick, and there are different totem animals for different parts of the island. So the idea that you're going to get sick by consuming totemically inappropriate protein is not something that you'll find in any medical textbook in any of the universities where any of us work. So a natural way to think about this is that it's driven by, in some sense that I'll try to make a little bit clearer later, or at least I'll try to map out some of the terrain. It's driven by representations. It's driven by beliefs. It's driven by states of mind. And there are a number of questions you can ask about a condition like this. And I'll try and ask some of these questions. And a natural way to, I think, cash out the idea that this is a condition driven by belief, by representation, is, I think, in terms of social construction, either constitutive or causal, depending on your point of view. And I'll say a little bit about that. And that's what I mostly want to talk about. So even though, I guess, people will disagree vehemently about the details, it's generally believed, especially by skeptics, I think, that contemporary psychiatry is built around a medical model, a biomedical, maybe reductive. I've always sort of taken seriously the idea that contemporary psychiatry should be seen as a kind of applied cognitive neuroscience. It has a sort of 19th century conception of disease as a particular pathological agent built into it. But it's also clear to everybody, I think, that psychiatric problems also depend on a range of social and cultural phenomena, contexts, causes, and the role of these and the integration of these sorts of phenomena into the overall structure, I think, is under-theorized, I suppose. So I'm going to talk in very broad terms today about some of these issues. There's a lot, I guess, of variation in psychiatry across the different timescales. You can think of very short-term variation over the course even of, a day. You'll get variation, I think, depending on how the system is responding to the environment. You can think in terms of biographical scales. You can think in terms of variation across cultures, sort of synchronously across cultures that are contemporaries of each other. There are also very interesting issues about historical explanation and variation. So some of you might know, for example, Bell's book, Holy Anorexia, which argues that medieval saintly women, particularly in Italy, who would greatly restrict their calorie intake and punish themselves in various ways, are recognizably anorectic, that there is a sort of lineage that connects St. Catherine of Siena with a modern anorectic, and probably also perhaps takes in fasting girls, who are a 19th century phenomenon. This again is very interesting. So there are questions about the comparison of diagnosis across historical time and across contemporary space. And I'll mostly be talking about the latter insofar as I have many examples, but both of these, I think, are relevant to what I'm discussing. Thinking about short-term variation, I think the easiest way to think about that is in terms of various sort of feedback mechanisms. I'll just mention these. I won't talk about them very much, although I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A. When it comes to very short-term variation, I think we're in the lineage of Claude Bernard and the cyberneticists. When it comes to culture, there's a number of questions, and this will be familiar to a number of people, I'm sure. One way of thinking about cultural variation is to think in terms of a form, right? An unusual form of an archetype that is captured by, say, the DSM, or by your favored picture of what a particular diagnosis is. Another way of thinking about them is to think about them as specifically unusual conditions that only get expressed in a certain area of the world or in a certain culture. And there's also a question about culture-bound conditions in weird countries, that is, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries. So, NATO members and people who help NATO members bomb the global South. I think Australia counts as a weird culture in this context. We don't tend to look at our own conditions and ask the extent to which they're culture bound, but I will ask that question shortly. So one way I think that people think about these sorts of conditions is to appeal to the notion of social construction. Certainly my students seem irresistibly drawn to this, and you can see why people would be interested in this sort of approach. The idea of social construction, either causal or constitutive, seems like a natural way to understand the causation and replication over time, which also has to be understood, of counter-normative conditions, that in some sense, there's a condition like Malgry where you can't really identify it with any particular biomedical diagnosis that we would recognize. A natural way to think about this is something like a social role generated by the sort of collected representations and customs of the local community. Something I won't talk about, but which I'd be interested in discussing in the Q&A, is what people think the relationship might be between theories of social construction and theories of cultural evolution, especially when you look at the persistence of any social phenomenon really across time. If you think about something like a gender role, if you think of that as socially constructed, it still has to be remade in every generation, in some sense passed on from one social generation to the next. And maybe we should think of that as something like an evolutionary process, a stabilization process. So I'm going to talk about social construction and understand it in a very broad sense to mean essentially socioculturally produced and sustained over time. And if you think in these terms, you could probably then aspire to doing psychiatry via a marriage of sort of, in the relevant aspects, neuroscience at one end and cultural transmission or evolution at the other, because as social neuroscientists will tell you, in order for the social to have some kind of effect on behavior or on anything sort of inside the skin, it has to be in some sense transduced. Representations have to have an effect on behavior via your central nervous system, which means that there will be information processing systems dedicated to the representation and sort of incorporation of these norms in your psychology. And so people like Ralph Adolphs and others have said, look, all you really need to do is look at the social cognitive mechanisms, look at the neuroscience. You can abstract away from everything else because everything else can only have an effect on your behavior via the transducers. Okay, so that's the background, and it's this idea of integration that I'm going to talk about. You might not want there to be integration. You might think integration isn't a desirable even goal, let alone a possible one. Someone like Helen Longineau will take that view. You've got this theory, you've got that theory, you know, they both work. Why worry about trying to integrate them? They're just talking about different things. I'm going to at least wonder what the prospects for some kind of integration are. So an historic way of looking at variation is to think in terms of culture-bound syndromes, patterns of behavior, cognition, and emotion, generally limited to and bound up with specific societies or sociocultural areas, but are regarded in those societies as forms of mental illness rather than just differences. So, you know, it's not like you know, people might dance differently over there, but that's not a mental illness. But if they behave in ways that are seen locally as pathological, then it is. You know, you'll notice that this is loaded with terms that stand in need of definition, notably ideas about culture and also ideas about what it means to be bound to a sociocultural area or bound up with something. What I'm going to do is not try and go through that in any detail, but just talk briefly about how this has been dealt with by the DSM-4, taking DSM as a kind of, as people do, we all do, a sort of stand-in for the psychiatric establishment. What DSM-4 says, it said that presentations conforming to the major DSM-4 categories can be found throughout the world. The particular symptoms, course, and social response are very often influenced by local cultural factors. In contrast, culture-bound syndromes are generally limited to specific societies or culture areas and are localized folk diagnostic categories that frame coherent meanings for certain repetitive, patterned, troubled sets of experiences and observations. So there's a distinction here right at the top. Psychiatry, right at the top, sort of divides into DSM-4 categories and culture-bound syndromes. DSM-4 categories are universal, even though they vary from place to place. So something like, I don't know, major depression on this view comes out looking like, yeah, well, for those of us who are watching the World Cup, it comes out looking like soccer, right? It's the same everywhere, but different cultures do it a bit differently, right? Japan don't play like Germany, Spain don't play like England, Brazil don't play like Ghana, but it's the same thing recognizably everywhere, whereas local cultural forces give rise to specific conditions that are understood locally as pathological. So there's a very sharp distinction between the universal and the culturally specific, and that's it. It's either the same everywhere or it's parochial, and it's only non-Western conditions that get the sort of parochial treatment in the DSM-4. If it's not a Western condition, then it is a candidate for being culture-bound. But if it is a Western condition, then it's not. It's universal. DSM-5, as many people will know, this will be familiar ground to a lot of you, I'm sure, has moved to a model of cultural concepts of distress, which is much more universal. In principle, this could be applied anywhere. Different communities, different societies, different parts of the world, however you want to individuate human groups, they will have local folk explanatory models that tell you what your problem is. My mother was Welsh. Welsh people believe that any physical ailment at all can be cured by running it under a cold tap. That's there's a local way of thinking about this, which you might want to learn about. But DSM-5 could have done a couple of other things. It could have, but didn't, revise some of the prior diagnosis. This is all being disputed, but in the process of moving from DSM-4 to DSM-5, it could have widened prior diagnoses to take into account some non-Western phenomena. Because Roberto's in the room, I'm terrified at all to talk about ataque de nervios, because it's his baby, but you could have revised the criteria for panic disorder to mention ataque de nervios. You could have revised the criteria for depression to manage Wetzinko. These are examples of conditions that are, in some sense, some people say, recognizably like existing DSM categories, and the categories could have been revised to take account of this, but they were not. And this, I think, demonstrates still the old idea that DSM categories are universal rather than specific. Further evidence for that comes from the disinclination to revise the DSM so as to include Western culture-bound syndrome. So an example that I owe to Peter Adrians is the example of bigorexia. Muscle dysmorphia, you go to the gym, you lift weights, you chug the protein shakes, your muscles get bigger and bigger. Adrians has argued, and I think it's very plausible to argue, this should be seen as a kind of westernized condition. The studies in the DSM come from the USA and Germany, the studies that are cited in DSM-5. If the studies had all just come from, say, Singapore and China, you probably wouldn't have called it a DSM condition. And I say how many people in the third world are doing this, and that's a serious question. I imagine some of them are, but the idea that this is a global problem is in some sense built into the DSM idea that if it's in the DSM, then it's a universal condition. So there's a number of conditions of which you can ask the following couple of questions that will be familiar again. One question is how different the two syndromes need to be before we recognize them as distinct. If you're a philosopher, you're likely to think at this point that this isn't a terribly interesting issue, perhaps because all we're doing is discussing identity conditions for kinds, right? looked from sufficiently far off. These all look like the same thing. If you zoom in, they look different. And the question is in some sense just about what identity conditions you choose. From far enough away, a calzone and a samosa and a meat pie all just look, a dumpling, all just look like, carbohydrate with stuff on the inside. And there might be certain purposes for which that's reasonable. If you opened a restaurant called Carbohydrate with Stuff in It, I'd pretty much definitely eat there every day. But you lose an awful lot of detail, an awful lot of specifics, and an awful lot of opportunities for sort of intervention in the world if you just lump everything together. Equally, if you just slice everything very finely, you capture a lot of detail, but you make it very hard to generate any interesting generalizations at all. One way you could approach this issue is to try and look at arguments for the claim, which I take it would have to undergird the DSM-5 position on universality, that everything in DSM-5 is kind of universal in some way. You'd have to believe that there is some kind of underlying shared human architecture or human nature. And it's the sharing of this across people that accounts for the existence of universal conditions. So I'm going to give you some options here that you could pick. One is to distinguish sort of everything as a constructionist theory. Everything is explicable via cultural, socio-historical, constructionist, social evolutionary mechanisms, right? So if you take this view, if you're what I'm going to call a constructionist, then your position is going to be everything in this area, everything in psychiatry perhaps, is explicable via these sorts of social constructionist theories. All the load-bearing parts of the explanation are going to be social constructionist ones. Then you could, sort of at the other extreme, take a universalist view, and a universalist view will say, look, mental illness is like, to adopt a line that Justin Smith once made about philosophy, it's like dance rather than ballet, right? Every culture dances. They do it in different ways. They do it with different traditions and different forms of instruction and different movements and different, but every culture dances. There's something about human beings that's universal, which makes that viable for everyone. That's the universalist position. There's a shared human nature, a shared human psychology. It varies a little bit from place to place, but still it is universal. And different lesions, different forms of damage to that shared heritage produce local forms of universal conditions. A third option is to say that everything depends on local mechanisms. So the model here would be to say, look, I'm a sort of reductionist biomedical type person about mental illness. I believe in the applicability of the medical model, but I don't think human beings are the same everywhere. I think human beings vary with respect to their underlying cognitive architecture in different places. And it's the breakdown in these local mechanisms that generate the variation that we see in disorder. You could take one of these views and apply it to different conditions. I've sort of put it here as kind of general choices, but you could pick A, B, or C depending on what you were interested in. So the second one, the universal one, treats psychiatry, treats mental illness the way you treat, I don't know, cholera or leukemia. It's the same thing everywhere. The third option, the particularist position, the obvious biomedical analog of this, I think, is lactose tolerance. Most of the world can't tolerate lactase, can't digest it can't drink milk as adults, but some cultures have evolved the ability to generate lactase. To sort of digest lactase. There's a particular sociocultural evolutionary trajectory that, people like me from my part of the world have followed. The Celts, the Scandinavians, a few others are okay with milk as adults. Most of the world can't do it. So that's the kind of like a particularist position. There's a very simple view about how you would go over how you explain things using either universalism or particularism. And it's the one that I've mentioned, which comes from, among others, my former colleague Ralph Adolphs. Imagine sort of a human head with arrows pointing at it, and the arrows are all labeled culture. In some sense, culture is on the outside. Culture goes into the organism via transduction. It's represented, these culture serves as inputs to your psychology. Cultural norms information is transduced and is used as input to the rest of the nervous system and is used to generate behavior. That's the simple view, right? Your brain is a representational device. Some of those representations are of cultural norms that vary from place to place. You plug them in, maybe you don't get it quite right, and it generates mental illness. Maybe you do get it right and it generates some other form of locally recognized variation. So that's, I think, the very simple view that appeals to a lot of philosophers who've got sort of sympathy for the basic explanatory programs of the cognitive sciences. Just as an aside for the metaphysicians, if you think of a diagnosis, as some people do, Carl Craver and Ken Kendler, for example, in their paper, and Peter Zakar, if you think of a diagnosis as a property cluster in the Boyd style, that is, a cluster of properties such that the presence of one symptom greatly increases the probability that you'll find other symptoms with it. They won't always necessarily occur together, but they're very, very likely to co-occur together. Something is holding them in place as a cluster. That something is going to be a biological or cognitive or tradition, something that generates the representations and the non-representational basis of those symptoms. On a view like this, you could say, look, constructionist positions and naturalist positions fit together, because there are going to be historical reasons why certain human groups are the way they are, why they have the sorts of psychology that they do. The breakdowns in that psychology might be explained in terms of the normal ways in which you would explain psychological abnormalities. But the fact that the mind, brain, the human psychology is in that position in the first place is a function of mechanisms that are partly socially or culturally conditioned. There's a certain kind of trajectory. It could be universal, it could be local. You can imagine a mechanism of very, very local scope. You can imagine something of much wider scope. I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but you know, if you really did want to explain the psychology of weird people, there's a lot of work on what it is that got sort of European societies across what Gellner called the big ditch between agrarian and modern forms of production, I suppose, or symbolic systems. There's an awful lot of work on this, and you can imagine an historical anthropological, historical sociological theory, which says, and as a result of this, people from Western Europe ended up with this kind of mind in this respect, and that mind is prone to breaking down in these ways. And that's the kind of integrative picture. But you might be skeptical of that whole approach, and you might be a constructionist. And it's that I want to finish with and spend maybe a little bit more time on. Many people will be familiar with Ian Hacking's idea of a looping effect, right? So Hacking says you come up with a theory of some pathological phenomenon. That theory is understood by the people who are being talked about. It influences their behavior in certain ways. It's transmitted among them in ways that cause it to deviate somewhat from sort of picture in the journals. You then have to revise the picture in the journals to take into account the way that people are behaving, which then produces a further feedback loop. So you get this constant, Hacking thinks of it as an unstable relationship between the theorizing and the people being theorized about. In principle, though, I think and have said that a picture like this could be used to generate a stable equilibrium over time, in which the looping doesn't produce instability, but in some sense locks into place, and you replicate the same social role, say, over the generations. Maybe gender roles that I've mentioned already, maybe they work something like this. The point about this sort of explanation, I think, is it's designed to come up with a theory of psychological abnormality that doesn't appeal to any psychology at all except ordinary textbook sort of neurotypical psychology. So this is an example from Hacking's 2010 paper on pathological withdrawal among refugee children in Sweden. You have these children who've endured dreadful hardship in their infancy. They've come to Sweden, they're in care, and this epidemic breaks out, in which the children all become mute, they become withdrawn, uncommunicative, unresponsive. They just sort of sit in their beds and don't lie in their beds and don't really seem to respond to anything. Hacking's view is that you can explain this by imitation and internalization. So to begin with, some children, maybe even one child, starts to sort of perform this behavior. The other ones imitate it. Perhaps it's a particularly high prestige kid. The other ones, for whatever reason, imitate it. And the imitation gets internalized. They're not putting it on. They're not pretending. It generally gets incorporated into their psychology in such a way as to make it a genuine expression of that psychology. But the mechanism by which it spreads is ordinary imitation of one's peers, followed by internalization. Your parents may have asked you when you were little if you did something particularly stupid, and you said that all your friends were doing it. They may have asked you, well, if all your friends jumped off the bridge, would you jump off the bridge too? The correct answer to that question is yes. Yes, you would, because that's how social networks function. You will imitate your peers and you will internalize the behavior. The thing about this, though, is it's a very general expression. It relies on a very simple general model of imitation and social contagion and internalization, which can be used to explain all sorts of things. There's one point about this. It also has, I think, one advantage. It lets you answer what I call the why isn't everybody question. Joan Jacobs Brumberg, in her book on anorexia, says, anorexia is a sort of specific condition. It's a sort of late 20th century middle-class capitalist condition. And then the response is, well, all right, but then why isn't every teenage girl in a middle-class capitalist house anorexic, right? If they're all living in the same society? And the answer could just be, well, for the same reason that not every little girl wants to own a pony or take ballet lessons. Not every little girl does anything. Not every little boy does anything. There is some variation. So if you have very general psychological mechanisms and a certain amount of natural variation, then only some people will respond to the culture in this way. These sorts of constructionist theories take their psychology, as I'm saying, off the shelf. The psychology that's in play here in Hacking's discussion, and I think in Brumberg and some other people too, is just this. It's just very general, non-pathological, neurotypical psychological mechanisms. The thing that explains why these Swedish refugee kids are socially mute and withdrawn is also the same thing that explains, why my son is covered in tattoos, or why everybody is doing one particular dance on TikTok. It's the same sort of phenomenon. It just generates behavior that we regard as pathological rather than non-pathological. But the psychology is absolutely human psychology. There's no psychology in social constructionist theory other than regular old psychology. Indeed, typically there's no explicit psychology, I think, at all. So you have this very, very general psychological theory, which can be plugged into an account that spreads a particular behavior via internalization and imitation. And on this view, social construction is competing with biomedical explanations, because biomedical explanations precisely appeal to notions of malfunction or abnormality or neuroatypicality. There's something wrong or unusual there. The hacking picture, the social constructionist picture, is there's nothing wrong or unusual here. All the explanatory weight goes into the norms or the representations. The means by which those representations spread, that's just perfectly standard. So I kind of worry this begs the question a little bit. The reason why social constructionist theories often look skeptical, if I'm right about this, is because the skepticism is kind of baked in from the beginning, in the sense that if your theory is built on the attribution to a population of perfectly normal psychology, then of course you're going to be skeptical about mental illness, because there's nothing there that's not regular old human textbook psychology. So if you were trying to integrate, behaviors, as I've said, maybe you should, with a kind of biomedical picture, what you would want is some account of how the sorts of non-textbook, the sorts of neuroatypical or malfunctioning or whatever your particular vocabulary is, the sorts of mechanisms of breakdown that psychiatry and cognitive psychology have appealed to, how those might work in a constructionist picture, how the processes of social homophily and contagion and transmission and construction work in a population of people whose brains are not textbook brains. Maybe you can do all this by thinking in terms of really unusual priors. The Bell et al. Paper is one about how communities online get organized around what look like delusional phenomena. Maybe, as Olivier Morin has suggested, you can think in terms of certain properties of representations which make them more attractive to certain kinds of minds, and maybe if your mind is atypical in a certain way, you're more likely to glom onto some representations than others, and certain mimetic properties will appeal to you that wouldn't appeal to typical minds. There might be various ways in which pathological behavior could be sustained and replicated by non-textbook psychologies. I think in general, social constructionist theories have just avoided psychology altogether, and maybe that is a difference between social construction and social evolution or cultural evolution. But I do think if you're going to take some kind of constructionist theory, you ought to wonder about the extent to which it's compatible with a kind of naturalistic view of abnormal psychology and vice versa, right? What we, I think, really want, and in some sense, all I'm doing is getting back to the starting place by a very roundabout route here. What we want is an integration. How might you do it? I think the crucial thing to look at and to pick up on is this, the role of psychology in social constructionist phenomena, which, or in social constructionist theories, which in general, I think has been completely absent. And I think you can see this across, I think you can see it, for example, even in the sort of Edinburgh School, the strong program in STS. There's just no psychology, right? Except for Wittgenstein, which doesn't count. There's no psychology in those guys. there's no psychology in social constructionist theories, and that really is what I'm appealing for. And two, and in particular, the idea that when it comes to abnormal phenomena, we want some kind of theory which looks at the interaction of social dynamics that are familiar from social constructionist theories and the sorts of explanations that you might get if you are doing the sorts of theories that psychiatrists like to build. Okay, I guess I'll stop there. I hope that came in on time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your